introduction, and before everything else, in case anyone has any questions from the last X number of lectures we've had. Does anyone have any questions? And if so, I will run down so you can repeat your question into the microphone.
Are you going to walk up and down the aisles?
Yes, I am.
Like Phil Donahue?
Yes, I am.
Remember him, Phil Donahue?
So,
Before there was Oprah, there was Phil Donahue.
questions, anyone?
Well, just to remind you, we've had, let me think, a lecture on Judaism, a lecture on Christianity, a lecture on Islam, and then we had the Passover Seder. So we've already had those experiences. Tonight there will be a lecture on religions of South Asia, Hinduism and Buddhism. And next month, the last evening...
Oh, you're taking my part.
Oh! the last evening, Judy will tell you. So just want to remind you what we covered already in case you have questions about that. Or I can ask you questions if you want.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, he's a university professor. We don't want him to ask us the questions.
He might grade you. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Raise your hand. I don't know what to ask. Well, was there anything from the last sessions that you had a question about? If not,
well, let me prime the pump a little bit. Prime the pump a little bit. Do you know what the names are of the various holy scriptures of these religions? What's the name of the holy scriptures of the Christians? The Bible. And how about of the Jewish religion? Okay, so are you familiar with what is the difference between those two? Would you like to know?
Yes.
Ah, see, we have a question. That's what I meant by priming the pump.
All right, and after that,
Is that a drill or is that a real evacuation? Let me find out from the receptionist, okay? Run the film in reverse. That woke you up. We have to reset our hearing aids now.
After the rabbi does his first deal, then I'm going to introduce him, in case you don't know who he is.
All right, so...
Are we okay? In the dining room.
So the one question I have is, we do not need to evacuate? Okay, that's what I really need to know. All right. So in Christianity, you may know that the Holy Bible contains an Old Testament and a New Testament. Right? Are you familiar with the fact that there are several hundred years gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament? So the Old Testament, more or less, about 1,000 years of religious experience, from the 1000s before the Christian era until the last couple of hundred years before the Christian era. You may know the names of some of the later characters like Ezra, Nehemiah. You may have heard of them. They lived 450 years before the beginnings of Christianity. So although there's only one blank page in the Christian Bible, that blank page is a number of hundreds of years. And the first part of it, which is about 3/4 of the Christian Bible, just page-wise, is what Christians call the Old Testament. And it's in the Jewish religion known as the Bible, the Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym like NATO. Right? Tanakh is the T is Torah, and the N is Nevi'im, and the K is Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Now, the law and the prophets you probably know because Jesus refers to them. Jesus is asked in the New Testament, what's the essence of what we're supposed to do? And Jesus says, you know this from the law and the prophets. You're supposed to love the Lord your God, and you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. So he's quoting the Hebrew Bible when he says that. And he's quoting the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, which is called the law. As for the prophets, you've heard of prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and so on and so forth. They were preachers. They were, if I can use the word, ambassadors from God's kingdom to the earthly realms. And they told people what people needed to hear. Not what people wanted to hear often, what they needed to hear. We say they spoke truth to power. They were not always very popular, but they were right. And it was only when the Jewish people was exiled to Babylonia, they lost their kingdom, the Babylonians destroyed their temple, that they stopped and they thought, gee, those prophets of doom and gloom, they were right. And the prophets who walked around singing, don't worry, be happy, they were wrong. So let's do our best to preserve and collate all the words of the true prophets. And that's how the Hebrew Bible became assembled. It was many, many centuries in the making, but it was assembled at the time of this Babylonian exile. And that's 500 years before the beginnings of Christianity. So that Bible was in existence. It was the Bible as far as Jesus of Nazareth was concerned. But after his career, the new faith community, the Christian church, began to circulate stories and traditions, memories, wise sayings attributed to Jesus of Nazareth. And we call those the Gospels. There were many, many Gospels, but ultimately 4 of them were accepted to be part of the Christian Bible. And that was by a church council in the 300s. And it was a church council called the Council of Nicaea. Some of you may have stood up in church and recited something called the Nicene Creed, which was also a statement of faith that was hammered out at the same church council, convened by a Roman emperor, the Emperor Constantine. He was the first Roman emperor to make Christianity an official religion of the Roman Empire. And being a Roman emperor, he wanted everything, foursquare. So he pulled together the bishops. He said, you got to come up with some things. None of this riotous diversity. You have to have a list of what are the books in the Bible. Need to know that. And you have to come up with a statement of what should a good Christian believe. And don't leave this room till you've got it. So they did what church leaders do. They argued. Right? You ever meet church leaders who don't argue ever? And they came up with what they came up with. So the New Testament is part of that process that began in the first years of the Christian era and continued up through about a century or so. And finally, about 2 centuries after that, they winnowed out which books are in the Bible, which books are not in the Bible. So that's a little bit of a PS about the Jewish and the Christian scriptures. And now I yield to the gentlewoman formerly from Maine and now from Virginia.
Okay, most of us now know Rabbi Panitz. I'm not going to read his bio because we know he's very well educated. All he has to do is open his mouth, and we know that. But the one paragraph in this, which I think applies to us, to him, I really like this paragraph. So I'm going to read this, and then he's going to talk on Hinduism first. Correct? First. Rabbi Panitz is committed to ecumenical dialogue and programming. For the past decade, he has served as the rabbi in residence at Christ in St. Luke's Church in Norfolk, that's an Episcopal church, preaching and teaching there regularly. He is taught at approximately a dozen churches in Southampton Roads, the Eastern Shore, in North Carolina. I think it's just wonderful that his knowledge is, I know this is what he studied, but his knowledge goes all around, has come back to us. We're going to enjoy it tonight. Hinduism first, Buddhism second, and then we'll take questions. So, I give you Rabbi Panitz.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thanks for that. Like so? Is that better? Yes. Okay. Quick show of hands. Has anyone been to India? I have not. A few people have been to India. Did you have the opportunity to engage people in a way that observed their religious lives, or that wasn't part of the trip? Yeah. Some people, yes? A wedding? In what faith? Was it the Hindu faith? So it was a by faith marriage. Because a Hindu wedding is a very, very interesting ceremony. Very long, lots of changes of a wedding gown for the bride. That's right. But at the end of a traditional Hindu wedding ceremony, the bride and the groom are supposed to go out together under the starry sky and look up to the heavens and make their pledges in the sight of heaven. Isn't that lovely? I start with that because I want us to recognize that we're about to explore a religion which is fairly remote to most of the people in this room, and yet which is absolutely the mother tongue of religious language for 900 million people, a billion people, and lots and lots and lots of people have been nourished by this set of traditions which are somewhat alien to us. So I want to take a few minutes to begin to unlock what is this religion called Hinduism. Most of us have seen a few images that are startling. You may have seen the image of the god or the goddess with many arms, or the god who kind of dances and there's a circle and the god is destroying and the god is creating, and so on and so forth. Or you may have seen a picture of a god with an elephant's head, Ganesha, the god, and so on and so forth. And all this seems exotic, alien. And we wonder, if we're going to be really honest, how are people taking this seriously? And yet they are. So I want to try to give us a sympathetic first look at one of the major religions of humankind. And I'm going to do so by thinking with you about some of the basic perceptions and issues of the world that find their expression in Hinduism. The first major observation is that whatever you look at and see in the material world is not forever. It's not going to be here forever. Certainly, whatever is living today is not going to be living forever. Even the mountain ultimately is eroded down to the sea. It takes a long, long time, but ultimately the mountains, which are thrust up so high, they become lower and lower. And that's why the Appalachians are lower than the Rockies, right? Because the Rockies are geologically a younger mountain chain. The Appalachians, already hundreds of millions of years, are beginning to be eroded. That's a basic foundational perception in the thought pattern of the Indian subcontinent. All things disappear. But then there's a second observation, which is just as powerful. Life comes back. The plant pokes its head up through the ground. It survives for a season, or if it's an olive tree, for hundreds of years. But even that is just a season from heaven's perspective. It produces seeds or fruit. The plant dies. But the fruit and the seeds go into the ground and new life comes forth. Basic observation. Impermanence and death, rebirth. Those are two of the bases of the Hindu view of all of reality, which are then applied to the animate and the inanimate world as well. So part of the Hindu perception is that the individual is reborn. Now, I don't know how many of you think in terms of reincarnation. I'll be back. I'll be back. And then, who is the I in I will be back? Is it the I that was left-handed in this lifetime? Will that I be right-handed or left-handed in the next lifetime? Will that I be a human in the next lifetime? I want to come back as a dog in a Jewish household. I know I'll be spoiled. So, what is our true identity? Is our true identity that which comes back? Or is our true identity the constellation of what makes you, you right now? See, these are tough questions, and they're profound questions. And these are questions that are at the heart of Hinduism. Let's push it a little further. If the material world is changeable, right? If no one is exactly like anyone else, and no one is exactly like his or her parents, but if life, capital L life, keeps coming back, what is permanent? If everything we see is impermanent, but we're convinced that there is something that is permanent, what is it? See, these are serious questions. And Hinduism has made those questions the central questions of its religious quest. Other religions have other central questions. In about a half an hour, I'll tell you what the central Buddhist question is. The central Christian question has to do with the concept of salvation. What do I do here and now that will make a difference for my soul forever? Judaism is starting from a different basic question. What do I do here and now that makes the world a better place? That's the question that energizes the engine of Judaism. It's a different question than the engine of Christianity. It doesn't make it more right or more wrong, but societies differ in this way. So the Hindu conclusion is that nothing material is permanent, and therefore the true goal of life cannot be met by pursuing only material pursuits. You can't achieve permanence by running after something which is here today and gone tomorrow, which certainly makes some sense, right? How do you get real peace? It's one of the concerns of Hinduism. And the answer is renunciation. Turn away from the temporary goods of this world and turn towards the permanent good, which Hindus identify as the godly. That's the permanent good. So the permanent good is achieved by renouncing the impermanent. Now, what happens when you associate that with the thought that life keeps coming back and that we keep coming back? We may not recognize who we've been the last time around, but it's still us in some way. So the Hindu thought is you have enough time for everything you want to do. Right? Don't worry about a bucket list, because if you don't accomplish it on your 842nd life, you'll accomplish it on your 4,325th life. You'll get there. But that within any one life, you can make a difference in terms of your ultimate where you're going to be when you come back. And for this, I want to introduce a basic Hindu concept that you've heard of in a way that you may not know that it's a Hindu concept. The concept is karma. I'm not talking about credit karma, but karma for the Hindu is a law of the universe, like a law of nature. And it says that your actions will produce a response in terms of where you will be for this life and for the next life. So what if a person lives a thoroughly despicable life? What if a person lives this life as if he's a cockroach? You come back as a cockroach. It's karma. It's not that a heavenly judge is sentencing you. It's no different than failing to manage one's diabetes and then finding that one's diabetic neuropathy is worse. It's a natural consequence of the choices that the person makes while living this life. That's your karma. Therefore, you can make it better too. You can live the kind of virtuous life, a life of nonviolence, a life of compassion, a life of loving kindness and mercy, and accumulate good karma, which gets you up the scale, not down the scale. So in Hinduism, the goal of social justice is not very strongly pursued. I mean, there's room for it, of course, but it's not the major goal that you have, for example, in Judaism, because this world, by definition, is like middle school. I don't know about your memories of middle school, but it can only be but so good. It can't be better than that. Your goal is to get to a place that's better than that, right? You don't want to just come back and be in middle school all the time. My favorite movie, which has a kind of a Hindu-type theme, is the Bill Murray movie Groundhog Day. Did you ever see Groundhog Day? Now, of course, they don't say they're Hindu, but to me, it strikes me as a very good exemplification of him. He's got to do it over and over and over again until he becomes a better person. And the Andie MacDowell character, her role is to make sure he becomes a better person and not to settle for anything less. Remember that? And finally, when he gets to where he needs to be, he's not condemned to everlasting return to the same place. A Hindu would watch that film and say, you've put a basic insight of my religion into a simplified language that even an American could understand. Even a Westerner could understand it when it's put in such a simplistic way, that when you finally become a better person, you end up in a better place. It may be a different version of you, though. See that? Different versions of the self. Now, the people who achieve the peace that surpasses this world are known as, quote, the silent ones, because they're not consumed with the noisy hubbub of this life. So your goal is to get past all the changeable and to achieve that serenity. How do you do it? Well, the Hindu religion teaches various ways of doing it, various channels. One channel is a channel of loving kindness. You're a good person. You're good to others. Your love for them characterizes who you are. And the karma of that helps you go up a notch. And hopefully you repeat that enough times, up a notch and up a notch. And finally, you get to the point of what's called moksha, people who are past the changeable. There's another way as well, and that is called yoga. Now, I know that many of you think of yoga as a kind of a low-impact physical fitness regimen, stretching, right? But what you may not know is that in its inception, yoga is a set of religious exercises. And they're exercises that are designed to make the person the master of that person's body and not have the body be the master of that person. So these physical / spiritual exercises will focus on being able to control your body, being able to control your breathing, slow it down, for example. I saw an amazing video of a Hindu pilgrimage. It happens every dozen years or so in India, and enormous numbers of people come to a confluence of some of the holy rivers of India. The Ganges, is considered the holy river of India. And it's like a county fair that goes from here to West Virginia. It's a huge, huge gathering. And in that pilgrimage, there was a woman who entered into like a subterranean, more or less a tomb. Great applause, by the way. And it was covered over, no faking about this. And then she came out of it several days later. And if you'd have looked at the volume of the cubic volume of that tomb, there shouldn't have been enough oxygen for her to survive. But she did. She came out unharmed because she has become such a master of what we consider the autonomic physiological functions that she could slow down her respiration, slow down her life functions to the point where that amount of time in that amount of oxygen, and it was not life-threatening for her. Amazing. Because we think of these things as beyond our control. But the whole system of yoga is designed to push those boundaries. So it's really amazing. And for the Hindu practitioner, that's a way of getting closer to God, because you're getting beyond the normal limitations of the body to something which is permanent. Now, I want to say something else in a historical sense that's important for us to recognize about Hinduism. It is not just one religion, it's a whole family of similar systems that developed across an entire subcontinent. Remember that India was not always politically united. It's been politically united, since 1947? Something like that, right? 3/4 of a century, more or less. And there were times that various kings or empires united much or most of India, but for a long, long time it was many different political and geographical regions as well. So there was seldom any attempt to enforce uniformity. And this shows in the rich variety of religious practices, myths, stories about different gods and goddesses, and so on and so forth. Do Hindus believe in one God? Do Hindus believe in many gods? The truth is, it depends on which Hindus you're talking to. Because there are some Hindus who say, of course, Vishnu is a god, right? And Krishna is a god, and Lakshmi is a god, and Shiva is a god, right? And goddesses, and so on and so forth. And other Hindus say, yes, but my friends know me as Michael, my children know me as Daddy, my grandchildren know me as Saba, right? But I'm still one person. So maybe these different names are different ways in which we know the one God. So there are Hindus who are monotheists, except that the traditional language of Hinduism is not monotheistic. And there are other Hindus who are perfectly happy with the thought of there being many gods. What I would like to do before I pass on to Buddhism is tell you two more things about Hinduism. The first is an explanation of something that may be very strange to us, and the second is to read to you my favorite Hindu text. Right? So I want to talk about the Hindu understanding of death. Death is frightening for some of us. The thought of extinction, of not being, is frightening for some of us. It's ironic that few of us are frightened at the thought that we were not here before we were born. I mean, how many of us are terrified of the fact that we just didn't exist in this world before our mothers were pregnant with us? Nobody. And yet, somehow the thought that the world will go on spinning when we're no longer here, that bothers us. You see that? The Hindu tradition teaches its people to think differently about that. Remember, the goal is renunciation. What's the biggest thing you can renounce? Your life, your body. The ancient Hindu religion, practiced 3,000 years ago and more, involved the fire sacrifice. That's the central religious ritual of Hinduism. The priests would go to the riverbank or they'd go to a Hindu temple and they would have a fire, sometimes a very small fire that you could hold in an implement in your hand. And sometimes they're like a little bonfire. And they would feed substances into it. Dried milk powder, for example, they would feed it into the fire, or other substances which could be burned up. They sensed that the fire was the principle of energy that makes the universe run. And they wanted to be in relationship with that energy. So the fire sacrifice became the central religious practice. So connecting that with a non-fear of death, and you have one of the most remarkable Hindu religious ceremonies, and that is a religious cremation ceremony after someone has died. Now, this is often done at the riverbank, and the Indian city of Benares is considered the holiest place where a person's life can come to an end. Hindus will make pilgrimages to get to Benares to die there and to be cremated there. That's the goal. There are steps leading down to the riverside, and there are funeral pyres. And it's a whole religious ritual where the dead body of the deceased is consumed, totally consumed by the flames, and then typically the son or next of kin will take the ashes and ceremoniously put them into the holy river. Because the holy river, the Ganges, was thought of as almost like the umbilical cord going from heaven down to earth. So the religion teaches you joyfully to renounce this shell and to give it to God. And that's your greatest and final gift. In the hopes, of course, that you get so much good karma that when you come back, your spiritual credit rating is automatically higher. See that? Okay, now, my favorite Hindu text You realize that not only are we not giving a full lecture to Hinduism, we could do a whole semester on it. It's such a fascinating system. But I want to share with you my favorite text. It's from a Hindu set of scriptures, not scriptures in the same sense as either the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, but nonetheless revered and holy in the Hindu tradition. The oldest scriptures are called the Veda, Veda, the Vedic literature. You may have heard of something called the Rig Veda, hymns that Hindu priests still chant after all these many, many, many centuries. After the Vedantic literature, there's a later literature which I'm going to read from called the Upanishads. Upanishads means the forest sessions, because there became a tradition in the Hindu faith where wise teachers, when they were ready to renounce the business, the work, the material goals that they were doing before their retirement, they'd go into the forest, they would live simple, ascetic lives, practicing their yoga, their spiritual exercises, and people would come to learn, to sit at their feet and learn from them. So the Upanishads is a collection of lessons learned from those teachers. The particular one I want to share with you is called the Katha, and its subtitle is Death Can Be Our Teacher. So in the Katha, it starts off with a young man who is of the priestly caste. Hindu priests, Brahmins, had children. They're married, they have children, they're not celibate. And this is about a young man who's a child of a priest. And the young man's name is Nachiteka. And he pestered his father with annoying questions. And one day the father's patience gave out. And Nachiteka is asking him questions about the sacrifices. He says, what merit do you get when you sacrifice a cow? And who are you trying to impress if you wait till the cow can't give any milk anymore and then you try to sacrifice it? Who are you fooling, Dad? You know, teenage boys sometimes are very good at skewering their dad's hypocrisy, right? So the dad gets angry, and Nachiteka said, "To whom will you offer me?" And the dad was angry. He said, "I give you to death." So the young man is profoundly shaken by this. And he thinks, well, many are going to die. I'm just one of many, many, many. Everyone's going to die. But let me find out what it's all about. So he decides to go to the Prince of Death, whose name is Yama. And in the story, he leaves his father's house and he goes to Yama's place. And Yama wasn't there. And you know why Yama wasn't there. The angel of death has to make rounds. He's got a very busy schedule, right? So Nachiteka waits. He's very polite. He doesn't sit down. He doesn't use the Barca lounger. He waits. And Yama comes back 3 days later. And he says, "I've been so remiss. You came and you waited 3 days for me. That you're such a good boy. I will grant you 3 wishes." You know where this is going. It's always 3, right? It's like Aladdin, right? For some reason, it's always 3 wishes in these stories. So Nachiteka says, for my first wish, I want to know what's really going on when we offer fire sacrifices in our religion. And Yama says, that's a very good question. And he teaches him all the mysteries of the Hindu fire sacrifice. And for the second question, he says, choose well. So Nachiteka says, my second wish is that Dad won't be angry with me when I come home because it's 3 days late. And Prince Yama says, don't worry about that. He'll be so happy to see you're alive that he'll forget his anger. So you've got one more question, lad. Make it a good one. One more wish. So Nachiteka says, I want to know what happens after I die. Good question? I think it's the best question, right? Yama says to him, "What do you want to know that for? Wouldn't you rather have an endless supply of beautiful dancing girls? Or all the gold in the world? Or great power over people? Isn't that what you want? It's your last wish." And Nachiteka says, "Sir, this is my wish. I wish to know this. This is truly my wish." At which point Yama says, "You just passed my test. And because you passed my test, I will answer your question truly." And then Prince Yama says to the boy Nachiteka, really a young man, "Really it depends on your state of mind. If you think that the world revolves around you, if the world is no bigger than your ego, you got to come back and do it again. Because you haven't learned what you need to learn. And you're going to do it again and again. There's no social promotion in the Hindu religion. You don't get to 5th grade because you spent 25 times in 4th grade. They don't pass you along. You have to learn what you have to learn. And as long as you think that this world is revolving around you, you haven't learned it. As many times as it takes. But once you know that there is a soul of the world, a world soul, and that your soul, the Hindu word is Atman, A-T-M-A-N, Atman, and that your Atman is to the world soul as one drop in a wave is to the waves that go through all the ocean. It's nothing different from the world soul. It's just one little bit of it that's inside of you right now and it's going to pass through you. Once you truly know that, you've learned the one thing that a human being needs to know. And at the end of your life, you've reached the finish line. And you're not going to want to come back because you've reached bliss. You've reached perfection. Why do you want to keep moving once you get to perfection? So that's what happens after you die. It depends on how you lived and what your state of mind was. And it's a great secret, which, thanks to the Upanishads, we now know. Anyway, I offer you that because, first of all, it's a beautiful story. And second, and more importantly, I think it'll serve to help us recognize that this religion, which on the one hand seems pretty strange with its strange-looking gods and goddesses and its different sets of values, cremation, and why is a cremation a festive party, and so on and so forth. But underneath it all, there are some very serious observations and some very spiritual thinking about the basic questions of life. So that's too short, but a brief introduction to Hinduism. Okay, let's take a breath, then we're going to move to Buddhism. The first thing I want to say about Buddhism is that it might be a great surprise to the Buddha himself that we think of Buddhism as a religion. That's a strange sentence. I'll say it again. The man who was the founder of Buddhism, an actual man who lived about 2,500 years ago, his name was Siddhartha Gautama. And he came from a particular aristocratic family in northern India, Nepal, the Shakyamuni clan. And his father was the king of a little kingdom. He really lived. It might be very surprising to him to hear that 2,500 years later, hundreds of millions of people regard Buddhism as a religion. He may not have thought of it as a religion. So I'm going to start off by telling you a famous story about the Buddha. A particular Hindu Brahmin, remember, Buddhism starts in India. Hinduism is the religion of India. So a particular Hindu Brahmin comes across the Buddha, and he can just tell by his countenance that this person is in a state of something amazing. Now, in Hinduism, gods come down to earth. Right? Krishna comes down as an atavar of Vishnu over and over again. So it wouldn't be surprising for a Hindu to think that he's seeing God incarnate. And listen, Christians understand that. You look at Jesus, it's not like you're looking at Tom, Dick, or Harry. Right? So the Hindu says to the Buddha, "Are you a god?" And the Buddha says, "No." "Well, are you a Messiah?" "No." "Are you a holy man?" "No." "Are you a prophet?" "No." "What are you?" "I'm the man who woke up." Such an interesting answer. I'm the man who woke up. I tell my undergraduate students, because I like to speak their language, that the Buddha was the prince of woke. You've heard of people being woke? The Buddha is the prince of woke. They like it too. So, what does this mean? We should use the life story, the biography of this founder of Buddhism, to help understand what its major issues are. Just as Hinduism has a major issue, Christianity has a major issue, Judaism has a major issue, and so on and so forth. What's the major issue of Buddhism? And I'm going to answer it by telling you the story of its founder. Siddhartha Gautama is born a prince. Tragically, his mother dies 7 days after his birth. We don't know why. Maybe it was postpartum fever or infection. We just don't know. He's raised by a very kindly maternal aunt. And his father, of course, who's a king, wants to make sure that he lacks for nothing. The father went to the astrologers, according to the story, when the boy was born, to find out what's going to be of this boy. And astrologers are very good at hedging their bets. It's like modern meteorologists. Got a 50% chance of a major thunderstorm. Think about it. If there is or if there isn't, they still win. They still get their mint chocolate chip ice cream from the regatta afterwards. So the astrologers tell the father, well, one of two things will happen. Either he'll become a great political leader, or he'll become a great holy man. Now, fathers often want sons to follow in their footsteps. So the Buddha's father didn't want him to become a great holy man. He wanted him to become a great political leader. So he kept him in the palace the whole time, and he gave him a very sheltered existence. He didn't want the Siddhartha, his young son, to know from the sadness of the world. No one was ever seen in that palace old or sick or dying. You just weren't allowed into the precincts there that the young man might see you. He never saw anything unpleasant. He had, servants to fan him, when it was too hot. Right? He had all of his physical needs taken care of. He was married off to his cousin at an age where we still think they're teenagers, and she was gorgeous, and they had a very lovely time together. And she bore him a son, and he loved his son too. And then he went outside the charmed circle. He got someone to take him outside the palace, and he saw a sick man. What's this? And the driver says to him, people get sick in this world. He never knew. Now he wants to go again and again. Second time, he sees an enfeebled elderly person. What's this? People get old. The third time, he saw a corpse. What's this? People die. Your Majesty, you didn't know that people stop living. They die. And the fourth time, he sees some mendicant Hindu monks, with their begging, and they're doing their spiritual exercises. And what's this? Oh, these are people who want to renounce all the material goods of the world because they think that there's a greater good beyond that. Profound, disturbing messages to this young prince. So disturbing that At age, I think something like 29, he turns his back on his lovely wife and his lovely little baby. He leaves the palace. He cuts off the long hair that was the mark of being a prince, discards his expensive robe, and he goes into the forest to start again. He finds a famous Hindu teacher, and doesn't really work. So he finds another famous Hindu teacher, and he begins practicing asceticism. He thinks the body and its incessant demands, feed me, that's what's in between myself and finally having peace of mind. If only I can get beyond the body, I can get beyond this dread that the body's going to fail me one day. So he is the most rigorous of ascetics. He eats the bare minimum to stay alive. He gets weaker and weaker. He does this for 6 years. He's so weak that he collapses in a shallow river. And with the very last of his strength, he pulls himself up so that he won't drown, and he makes it to the dry land and he collapses again. And he might have died right then and there, but a very kindly young woman is passing by, and she has some, I don't know if you want to call her. You ever go to an Indian restaurant and they have like this delicious watery rice pudding? I forget what it's called, but you ever have that? It's in their lunch buffets, right? I don't know what it's called. But she gives him a few spoons of rice milk and rice pudding, and it revives him. And he says, asceticism isn't the answer, because torturing my body didn't make me any closer to understanding the secret of existence. So he came to the first basic realization of Buddhism: moderation. Don't be a slave to your body. Don't be an enemy to your body. Don't think that eating and enjoying is what it's all about. And don't think that eating at least enough is a problem. So his first great teaching is moderation. And he goes off on his own quest to understand, to achieve what Buddhists call enlightenment, or what the Buddha said was to wake up. He gets to a particular tree and he thinks he's close to the answer. And he settles down under the tree. It's called the Bodhi tree. It's a fig tree. And either that tree or more likely some descendant of that tree is still there in India, northern India, and it's a site of religious pilgrimage to this day. And while he was there, he came to his basic realizations that I'm about to tell you what he taught. And he thought, okay, this is it. I know what I need to know. What else do I have to do? I've reached the finish line. Life doesn't need to go on. I could end it right now and be perfectly okay. But he got up from that tree because of the second great teaching of Buddhism. Second great teaching of Buddhism is there's a world out there of unhappy people. Shouldn't I do what I can to ease their unhappiness? If knowing what I know will help them to feel the way I feel, shouldn't I try to do that? So compassion for suffering humankind launched him on the career that took him for the rest of his life. So he leaves this fig tree and he starts just walking around trying to figure out, where am I going to go? What am I going to do next? And he gets to a particular deer park. You know, the kings back then, they used to like to go hunting, so they would stock parks with deer and other animals that they would then go hunting. He gets to a deer park in a place called Sarnath, and he sees 5 of his former buddies when they were all being ascetics together. And they see that he's looking at least reasonably well fed. So they say, he wimped out. He lost his moral fiber, right? We're not going to show him any honor. But they couldn't help themselves because there was something about him that just impressed them so much. And he gave them the first sermon. This is what's called in Buddhism setting the wheel of the teaching in motion. Now, the Buddhist word for teaching is dharma, Dharma. So now I've taught you two important words. I've taught you karma, and I've taught you dharma, right? So karma is the inevitable consequences of your actions that will either make it better or worse for you in the next life. And dharma is the teachings that you need to know so that you too can wake up. So the dharma starts with what the Buddha called four noble truths. What is the first truth? There's suffering in this world. I don't think that's a hard truth for people to agree to. Second truth, I'm going to tell you what is the cause of suffering in this world. And you and I might have lots of thoughts about what causes suffering in this world. You got to realize that the Buddha's answer, which might not be your answer, and it might not be my answer, it's an answer which comes from that Hindu world that he was growing up in. The cause of the suffering in this world is that you are always discontent because you always want something and you want it the wrong way. What you want is impermanent, and therefore you can't be truly happy. Because you don't really want impermanence, you really want permanence. But by identifying what you want as the impermanent, you're condemning yourself to always being unhappy. It's like those so-called breakfast cereals of the 1960s, Frosted Flakes, okay? Sugar Smacks, right? If you have breakfast on that, you're guaranteed to be ravenous by 9:30 in the morning because of the insulin highs and insulin lows, and it's going to kick your blood sugar up too fast, right? And the insulin kicks in, and then your blood sugar plummets. And by 9:30, you're so hungry that you can't pay attention in geography class. That's why Americans are so bad at geography, because they had Frosted Flakes for breakfast. Blame it all on General Mills and Kellogg's. Post, there you have it. So the Buddha says the second noble truth is that we are the cause of our unhappiness because we are attached to the wrong things. We're attached to the impermanent, right? It's like Hugh Hefner, remember him? He was attached to virility. So, poor guy kept, who makes Viagra? Not Merck. What's the company that makes Viagra? Pfizer, right? He kept Pfizer in business all by himself. But that doesn't make you happy in the eternal long run, right? So the Buddha didn't teach that in particular, but that's just an example of what he's teaching, right? So the Buddha is saying, you want the wrong things. You're attached to impermanent things. No wonder you're always unhappy. The third noble truth, just as there is suffering, so is there release from suffering. We all want to accept that. The fourth noble truth is, I know how to get there. And that's the heart of Buddhism. It's 8 different steps: right thinking, right acting, right speaking. Basically, you have to be your best self ethically, and your best self spiritually, and your best self in self-control. And you yourself get yourself to enlightenment. The Buddha makes no room for hesitation on this, that it's not any God who is saving you. That's why I'm telling you, he might be surprised that so many people think of it as a religion. And he doesn't have you reading scriptures spoken to you by God or by the angel Gabriel, as in the Muslim religion, that will tell you what you need to know. The answers are inside of you. You need to meditate. You need to practice this meditation, practice self-control, and get to the point where you are captain of your soul and master of your fate. That's the teaching of the Buddha. So he teaches it to those 5 disciples, and they become his first disciples. And then he finds some more, and they become his disciples, and then more disciples, and then from his family, they become, and then his wife wants to become a disciple. That's a problem. He never thought there was a place for women in this system, but he was convinced. Of course there's a place for women in this system. What difference does it make if you're a man or you're a woman? It's the human condition. So think about it. 2,500 years ago, he voted for women's suffrage. It wasn't his first thought, but he came around to the right decision without too much difficulty. And he creates something called the Sangha, Sangha, which is a monastic community with a men's division and a women's division. So I think it's the first institution in human history where a woman could escape the drudgery that society was condemning her to and become a sister and become perfectly happy with her austere, right? There's no possessions, austere but free existence. So that's what he did for the rest of his life. He went around guiding the monks and the nuns, reaching out to laity. They didn't have to become monks or nuns in order to become Buddhists. They just had to learn what he was trying to teach, or at least try the best to learn. He does this for 45 years. He dies a natural death. On his deathbed, his many, many disciples come to him. They're crying and they're so upset because the founder is dying. And he says to them, "This is natural. I'm ready for it. Every one of you will need to be ready for this. And it's okay. Remember that the answers are all inside of you. Be ceaselessly, fearlessly steadfast to wake yourselves up." And then he died. Isn't that an amazing life? And his life is a good vehicle for understanding the religion. I want to give you one little PS, because that produced a certain kind of Buddhism which we still see today, that's called Theravada. It sounds like a flu remedy, right? You go to Walgreens, pick up some Theravada. No, Theravada means monastic. The model of the successful Buddhist in Theravada Buddhism is the monk or the nun who has achieved enlightenment, just like the Buddha. See, the Buddha is not like Jesus Christ. Anybody could become a Buddha. He was maybe the first, maybe not the first. He was one who was able to express it so that people could all learn it and follow that path. About 500 years later, a different form of Buddhism became popular, and it's called Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is Buddhism that's focused not on going into a monastery. It's focused on living in this world. And living in this world, there's a new culture hero. The culture hero is not what they called an arhat, A-R-H-A-T, who's a monk who's withdrawn from the world. The new culture hero is someone called a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is someone who is ready to jump ship of this world because he's achieved enlightenment, but he or she stays behind to help you and me. I'm not going to leave the Titanic because there are more people to rescue. That's the bodhisattva. That's the new culture hero of Mahayana Buddhism. Now, to this day, you can find both schools of Buddhism in places like Sri Lanka, Indochina. You see the Theravada Buddhism very strongly. But in other places, China, Korea, Japan, and the United States of America, you see Mahayana Buddhism. And there's a particular reason. The British Empire, 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, put the British in political control of areas of the world where Theravada Buddhism was being practiced. So that's well known in the British Isles. One man, one remarkable man, a Japanese Buddhist monk, a Zen Buddhist monk, whose name was Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, came to America as a young man in the 1890s. 1492, Columbus did what? Sailed the ocean blue. Okay. 400 years later, 1892, Chicago, we were talking about this at dinner, the city of big shoulders. Remember that? Chicago has a Columbian exposition, a World's Fair in Chicago. And one of the things they had was a world parliament of religions. And this young Zen Buddhist monk, D.T. Suzuki, comes to take part in that. Fast forward 50 years plus, after World War II ends, elderly monk, same man, D.T. Suzuki, comes back to America. And America is spiritually hungry. Everywhere he goes, he's got sold out lectures, standing room only lectures about Zen Buddhism. And so in America, Zen is the form of Buddhism that we know. And of course, many Americanized versions of it. Anyone know the name Jack Kerouac? Beatniks, motorcycle enthusiast, 1950s, right? Jack Kerouac was part of the American embrace of Zen Buddhism, and so on and so forth. So in Buddhism, the goal is not salvation, the goal is enlightenment. The power to do so, to become enlightened, is within you. If you think in a disciplined way, and talk in a disciplined way, and live in a disciplined way, it can be done. So ultimately, it's a very optimistic system. And maybe it's even a religion. So we've done a whirlwind of trying to cram two world systems into 1 hour, but I certainly hope you've enjoyed this ever so brief introduction to two of the major religions of the world. Judy, did we tell them what to expect next month or not yet?
I'm sorry?
We didn't yet tell them what to expect next month, did we?
No.
That's what you're going to do. Okay.
First of all, I'm going to see if there are any questions.
Of course.
Do you have any questions tonight?
Yes.
I will run up and down.
Yes.
How does
No, wait a minute.
How does Confucius and Confucianism tie into Buddhism?
That would require a whole other lecture, unfortunately, because I'm going to give you a quick answer. Confucius is as old as Buddhism, and Buddhism had not yet reached China. Just a very quick bit of history. Did you ever hear of something called the Great Silk Road?
Yes.
Okay. So the Great Silk Road was not opened up until the first emperors of China, the Han Dynasty. You ever hear about that dynasty? H-A-N, the Han Dynasty of China, was able to gain political, which means military, control of the corridor that leads west from China through Central Asia and ends up at the north shore of the Black Sea. That's the Great Silk Road. That meant that not only were goods, but ideas were also traveling back and forth. That's when Buddhism crossed the Himalayas, which are a pretty formidable barrier, and made it into China. So the system of Confucius is pre-contact. What is it about in 2 sentences? Confucius lived at a time when everybody was fighting everybody. It was called the era of warring states. And Confucius asks a very important question. How can we get past this era of everybody fighting everybody? And his answer is, you have to start with the individual. If you create a morally superior individual, you're creating a cell that will ultimately become the body politic of a world which can live in peace. That's the Confucian project. That takes a whole other lecture, but now you know 2 sentences about it.
Anyone else? All right, I'm coming.
Why is Buddha depicted as a short, fat, happy little man?
That's a wonderful question. I want you to know that that is typically one of the bodhisattvas, rather than Siddhartha Gautama himself. There are, in fact, a number of different kinds of depictions of the original Siddhartha Gautama, but none of them are as old as his life. The first time that people really began doing pictures of him was about 500 years later. And we think that that's because of the influence of Hellenism, this Greek culture which raised sculpture to hitherto unequaled heights of depiction, of powerful depiction of how people actually looked. And under the pressure of competition with Hellenism, the Buddhists of that era began to depict Buddha. But at first, the first depictions of Buddha were footprints, because they tried to make the point that he was itinerant. He walked around teaching his message. And they didn't care what he looked like. And he didn't care if people knew what he looked like, because that wasn't important. 500 years later, they began making pictures of him. Who knows what he looked like? But the rotund, happy figure that we know from certain restaurants right, is actually the bodhisattva of compassion, thought of as literally an embodiment of compassion, which is a nice thing. So that's the famous statuette. Oh, good question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay.
Ma'am, we have a question there.
I thought I'd ask you at one of the lessons, why didn't the Jews accept Jesus? And you said they were looking for a king.
Well, what they were looking for was freedom from the Romans and peace. And neither of them happened. The Romans stayed in charge, and there was warfare every year. So most of the Jewish people said, well, we got to keep waiting. Whereas the people who became Christians said, well, that'll happen when there's a second coming. And what Jesus did in the first coming was he freed us from sin. Second time, he'll free us from the Romans and give world peace. So the difference is that the Christians are waiting for a second coming, and the Jews are waiting for a first coming. I like to say, we're all waiting. Good question.
Anyone else? Anyone? Okay. Well, we really have appreciated Rabbi Panitz being with us again. And we have one more time. Put this down now. Here's this one. Okay. Wednesday, June 26th. How religions have been affected by modernity. And honestly, I think, considering the world today, this is going to be a very interesting lecture. Okay? June 26th. Must be about 4 weeks from now, something like that. I hope to see you all here, and we're very grateful that you are here with us.